Anyway, hello everyone. Good afternoon or evening, maybe morning. It's great to see you all here. As I mentioned before, the panel in a way already started. These are moments for conversation more than anything. Hello, Paula, and hello, Sojang, and Abel, Able. I, no, and I guess that it's working really
Hi,
well
Abel.
because so it's someone that Antoinette knows. That's amazing. Um, because we were just talking here, and that's so good. That's maybe the best thing about any conference, and we are trying to bring a little bit of this spirit to the online Zoom world with the Using Without Walls online seminar program. So I'll just start with the regular formal introduction, and we'll be moving on to the talks or to the conversation and presentation soon. Of the presentations, I hope that everyone already watched it. And anyway, this is the third week of our online seminar, and it's a way to accommodate other presentations that couldn't take part in the conference and exhibition that we had here at Queen's University in Ontario. Yeah, 4 weeks ago, perhaps. We're going back to back with this program. So it's amazing to be able to use these newfound possibilities or these possibilities that the pandemic popularized to try and expand uh, conference academic programs, and we are trying to do this in a way that makes sense and makes the most of its possibilities. Museum Without Walls is a survey on virtual art institutions and communities. That's the second year that we are running it. Last year it was connected to a Brazilian museum. This year it's hosted by Queen's University in Canada, and as we keep remembering, Queen's University is like many museums in the world, is situated on unceded land, the ancestral home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. And as I already mentioned, I think for these encounters, we are having the presentations being posted in advance in our YouTube page, and we hope that people watch them and come just for the discussion. If there's no discussion, there will be like a sort of very fancy interview where I'll be asking questions very different and sometimes very strange questions to our guests. This is our third encounter. We'll be talking about institutional leaks today, and that's more or less a way to address everything that materially, technically, informationally, everything that exceeds the institution. And it's an opportunity for us to examine the contradictory relationship or the ambivalent relationship we often have with institutions, which on the one hand, they support, but at the same time, they control. They nourish, but at the same time, they contain. So yeah, and I had some other maybe comments or reference to bring to this conversation, but I'll be moving on to our guests and to like the initial round of questions. And we can maybe come back to this later. So today here with us, we have Antoinette Lafarge, an artist and writer whose visual work has taken form as computer-mediated performance, programmed installations, and digital prints. Recent books include Sting in the Tail, Art, Hoax, and Provocation, and Louise Brigham and the Early History of Sustainable Future Furniture Design. Recent art projects include Deep Earth and Burning Time. Her writing and artwork have appeared in Art Journal, Wired, Leonardo, Ada, the Southern Quarterly, the Moss Journal of Science Fiction, and elsewhere, as well as in anthologies from MIT Press, Oxford University Press, and other international presses. We also have with us Karine David, an assistant professor in contemporary museum and collection studies at Leiden University. Her research involves digital collections and the history of museums on the web. She's board member of the Henri Derval Foundation and co-chair of at VARCnet. Together with Ross Perry and Vince Zikan, she's co-editing the book Museums and Digital Confidence. We also have with us Leah Carrera, PhD student at the Winchester School of Art of the University of Southampton. She has a Bachelor in Media Studies from the Federal University of Espírito Santo, I had to say that, and a first master in Media Technologies and Aesthetics from the Rio de Janeiro University, where she developed research on digital art and image appropriation. Her second master in Media Cultures as part of the Erasmus Mundus program, focused on exhibition practices, online exhibition practices. Previously, she has worked as a researcher for the ZKM in Germany, where she developed research on online-based curatorial platforms and practices, and on artificial intelligence in the arts. And finally, we have René Cepeda, a Mexican multidisciplinary designer, artist, and art historian specializing in new media art. He currently teaches at UNARTE and is the curator of the New Media Caucus Heather Footer Gallery. He holds an MA in art history and curating from Liverpool Hope University, and a PhD in curation and display of interactive new media art from University of Sunderland. As a curator, he creates immersive and interactive exhibitions that combine formal curatorial practice with creativity in design to entertain and educate audiences. My dear panelists, thanks so much for your presence and your presentations. Thanks also our audience. And as I said, I will start with some comments and questions for our guests. Anyone in the chat, feel free to raise your hands and also comment whatever you want. The idea is that we start with this question so that we have a starting point, but this could lead to more open conversation. And I'll be following the order of the presentations. First, speaking about fictive museums, artists as institutions, presented by Antoinette Lafarge. And I found the presentation extremely generative. It got me thinking how it's a topic that has interested me for a long time, actually. I really love Marcel Brodard's Museum of Modern Art Department of Eagles. It's interesting how the existence of these fictive museums, they tell us a lot about the fiction of the institution itself and what this fiction does, what it can do, and how it operates. And it's fascinating how a lot of these projects work through metonym, as you have underscored, Antoinette, like through the mobilization of paratext in such a way that the paratext, all the surrounding elements, account for an absent text behind them, or the absent infrastructure behind, if it is absent. And I was interested in how you also commented on the fact that the artists use these institutions, these fictive institutions, as a way to play with the artistic persona as a poetic element. And I was wondering if we can also think of these institutions as ways to play with the institutional apparatus itself, themselves, perhaps. And if these fictive institutions could become a technique for broader intervention and reimagination of institutional realities available to other kinds of actors and social movements, perhaps. Have you encountered some of these in your research? Do you think that could be something that could happen or already happens in the artist projects?
So that's a huge question.
You can answer whatever you want. It was more a conversation starter.
Well, there's a whole lot of different levels at which things can have the kind of impact I think you're asking about. And one of them is that just by imagining themselves as institutions, operating as institutions, creating facades that people don't know are facades, they already ask people to suddenly become dubious about every institution, including the ones that they think they know are just big solid institutions. Like suddenly even MoMA looks shaky if it turns out that you can't tell the difference between a facade and a real institution. At another level, you have in another chapter of my book that wasn't about institutions specifically, I talk about the group Artmark, which, as many of you probably know, turned themselves legally into a corporation in order to have some of the protections and affordances that American law specifically offers to corporations, protections that are in some ways much stronger than individuals are now afforded, so that they were interrogating a different power structure by going all the way into legally adopting an identity. So there are different levels of identity claiming, power claiming, and legal rationalization of the enterprise. And I have to say, I was extremely taken with Leah's presentation. I happened not to know about that project. I keep coming across fantastic projects I never knew about. And I think that's a really exceptionally interesting example because an artist has claimed a building that has its own history, that could have had its own website, but then who is authorized to make a website for something? Who is authorized to speak as something? And I think it's very interesting that this project gives voice not only to various artists, but to the lost Jewish family that's behind the magazine history. And one of the things I actually really wanted to ask her about was, does come up with this question, it connects this question of power and authorization, who is allowed to do stuff? Because one of the issues that struck me that might have arisen in the course of this project at some point that I couldn't find information about was who owns this enormous archive of images of the family and their history. Some of that might still be under copyright and not actually available to legally put on a website. Did they appropriate this history in order to make truth more visible? I'm kind of interested in whether there were hidden authorization issues. That this comes up with museums, of course, because museums are very keen on only putting authorized things on the web and then making sure nobody can touch it unless it's in a specifically authorized way. So I'm very interested in these questions of who's authorized to do what in these institutional settings as well. So Leah, I'd love to hear if you have any, I'd love to hear about that particular aspect of the power struggle over images and information dissemination.
That's a great question. I also was super happy to see your presentation because I think our projects had this connection, and I was even relieved not to have to go into too much details in terms of institutions that you were going to talk about. So that was really of authorship and who gets the right to do it. I think they are the creative directors, Bernard and Seth. They have been struggling with this themselves because I think they've been questioning this themselves. And can you guys hear me? I think I'm kind of freezing. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. I think it's my connection. So they're struggling with this, and I think they brought up these questions as well. But I think most of the content that they've used, either they produced it themselves, I mean, going there and photographing the building from the outside, or using the publications that are available actually in the Vienna Library. I think it's the library, if I'm not mistaken. And recently they partnered with one of the artists they commissioned. I forgot the name right now, to restate the publication rights for these magazines as a way of also to reclaim ownership of this and be able to work also with the publications, but symbolically and create this meaning around being able to reclaim the ownership of the publications that the let's say original Palas used to produce. But I think they haven't had issues with that directly. 2019, and I was involved in these conversations. They were able to contact the last surviving family member who was in the US, and unfortunately, Tom Lona, he passed away during the pandemic. So they were actually discussing this with him, and he was on the website. You can actually see his read his view of his journey of rediscovering this lost family and this history and what he was entitled to, let's say. And you can read this on the website. It's really a really moving midst of actually working together with him to try. But I don't think he had or they had this any issues with it because they were really connected and collaborating with each other in the sense. And if I
So you suddenly start to break apart really drastically, but maybe next time follow Antoinette's suggestion and turn off the video while I was speaking because internet treasures medium.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, yeah, sometimes it's on and off. I don't know why I'm even using the cable. But I also have a question for Antoinette because I was really connected to what she was saying, and I wanted to ask you that if in your research if you ever felt that you were also being historical documentation, you were maybe not sure what was real and not real, what was actual events and what was fictive events in your research.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the things that made the book extremely difficult to research and also fascinating, like a giant, all research is like a detective novel that you get to star in, but it's even more so when you're trying to figure out where the various truths are in these stories. And I was really determined to be as accurate as I could in my book, even though I am very, I'm very engaged myself with this kinds of work that's dubiously factual and fictional. I wanted my book to at least be a resource where you could find out as much as could be known at this moment in history. And in fact, I had that same question about this website, not only because I now approach everything with a certain degree of suspicion, a kind of productive suspicion, which I find very exciting actually, to not be certain what's happening. But the fact that the main artist is named Bernhard gar Nichtnik, that sounds a lot like the German expression gar nichts, which means essentially nothing. And I wondered if it made me wonder if not just a pseudonym, but whether the whole thing was completely made up. And so what happens is I then do a lot more digging to try to see if I can figure out where the tendrils of fact and fiction are intertangling with each other.
That's a really curious comment because in the end, after I've been researching this project since 2016, in the end I've become, because even his brother is called that. So researching this in the end, I was kind of part of their game. So this is why I was asking you if you also felt that, because I think as a researcher, maybe this would reflect on the other participant states, like we have to sometimes account to our own participation in the process of researching institutions and artworks and artists, and recognizing our role also in actually creating some kind of narrative at some point, right, of these projects. So if even I really don't mind if they are playing a game or if it's a real name or not. I think I recognize my role in this process and bringing the institution to life, let's say, in my way as a researcher.
Yeah, and this question of what stories can be told, it also, for me, it connects back to what Renee was talking about in terms of censorship, because censorship is the overt suppression of certain kinds of information, but then there's other kinds that are suppressed through more subtle means, like almost what I think of as the censorship of copyright law. There's enormous amounts of stuff can't be handled the way they need to be handled. So I was very taken by Renee's discussion of how you route around and deal with these kinds of things. And I'm wondering if, Renee, I'm really curious about whether I hope I'm not preempting Gabriel's question, because I really connect this to the problem of storytelling on the margins. Like, you always have to go to the margins because censorship is never going to go away, but the margin keeps moving. Is that what I understand your own conclusion is?
Yeah, one of the issues is, okay, so you want to be visible on the web, right? You want to be on Facebook, you want to be on Instagram, you want to be on TikTok, all these things. However, because of corporate prudishness, you can't be. So you move to the periphery. But this periphery eventually gets co-opted, as we saw with Tumblr, where I think it was Yahoo that bought it, and then it lost all its, well, it's not its free speech. And I understand certain degrees of censorship that were needed because of things like white supremacy and children abuse and all these things. However, that's not what happened. What they ended up doing was censoring alternative identities, all these things, whereas white supremacy apparently is fine. So it's this way that you have to find a new place to move yourself, right? But for some reason, the web is very welcoming to conservative far-right ideas, but anything that is alternative is considered bad, and it's very hard to find a home for it. So in the end, your solutions are, you find this very, very peripheral thing, and then you redirect people, or you just take the hit or do it in-house. But in-house is so expensive sometimes. Some of it can be done. Like that's what I am doing with header footer, which is just basically, I learned how to code, I learned how to do Unreal Engine spaces, I learned how to do all these things, but it takes so much time out of my time. So obviously my output is way more limited than it would be if I could present on more traditional spaces. So yeah, censorship is this issue, and it hampers everything in culture, because even simple things as nudes, which is something that has been accepted in art for a long time, is not acceptable in YouTube, in Facebook, on Instagram. And the only way you can defend yourself is if you have a big following, or you're a very, very, very famous person who produces a lot of money for these platforms. If you're not, you're simply pushed aside and ignored. I don't know if that answers your concerns. At the same time, going back to what your work is, Antoinette, those questions that you're posing about these fictional, well, not fictional, but these non-traditional galleries, museums, spaces, I face that every day, because Header Footer is an online gallery. We don't have a physical space in the Media Caucus for it. So at what point do I stop being a blog or a web page and I become an institution, right? And it's something I still don't have an answer for. I don't think we'll ever have an answer. I guess at the end, it's one of those things, you'll know it when you see it. And one of the ways I think I'm negotiating that is making links with other spaces that are actually physical. So I'll kind of like in a Wittgensteinian form, I'm becoming an institution through familiar resemblances, right? So I have exhibitions, they have exhibitions. I loan works to them. So therefore, I slowly integrate myself and my institution within the traditional definition of it. But I don't know. I don't know if that's something that you considered when talking about these types of institutions with artists, which seem to be much more stable than what I'm doing.
You know, I actually think that's a really interesting point that I didn't talk about at great length in my book, but it's when you start thinking about yourself as other than a solitary human being or a member of a group, it's when you become organized as a almost third person thing, almost as a kind of conceptual object. And I think that it must depend, this is something I'd like to think more about, thank you, well, on what your own society and culture thinks an institution is. Like we define them in the United States very specifically with in legal ways. There's a nonprofit kind, there's a corporate kind, there's a partnership, and that these are kind of like reified objects. They're reified through law. And I think that's one of the primary ways to be an institution, as opposed to a group or a community, other kind of collective entity. But I'm talking off the top of my head there. Maybe somebody who's thought more about museums and institutionality has a stronger answer to that. But I do think it's a very Duchampian that the minute you start to think of yourself as an institution and act that way, you are one, whether other people recognize you as such or not.
Yeah, it's also something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted perhaps to try and also bring in the topic of museums on the web to the conversation so that we can spread among all participants. Because I guess that one central topic of the Museums Without Walls as a project, is that the name? Yes, is these new configurations for collective forms that we use it to recognize as institutions. And nowadays we have, I don't know, online platforms, and we have actual museums that rely on buildings to work. And why not we have museums that rely on web pages, that it's all they are. And some of our other panels will speak to that as well. And during Carrie's presentation, first I was very curious to know about, if it's not like a sort of confidential thing, which kind of submissions they have received so far for the journal issue. But I was also curious about the one case that you mentioned of the Guggenheim Virtual Museum of '99, because the Guggenheim is like one of the, maybe the quintessential franchising museum, that you have many different ones all over the world. And it's never really about the art or the collection in the first place. It's about the brand. It's about, well, the buildings themselves. And maybe that's what we should be moving away as we try to embrace these other social technical configurations as the homes for our collections or for our culture. So it got me thinking of how much the museum on the web can be a franchise instead of a double, and what kind of relations we can trace between the museum on the web and the original museum, which also has to do with the fact that sometimes there's no original museum. There's nothing behind the facade, or the web is where we find ourselves in the end.
Yeah, I can answer this, but also answer why, when something becomes a museum, because it's a quite simple construction, at least within the UK and the Netherlands. There's the Museum Association in the UK, and within the Netherlands, they have the Dutch equivalent of that. And they give the status museums when a museum is requesting it. And there needs to be some things in place. These criteria I don't know by heart, but it can be, for example, that there needs to be a registration, I think, of the collection in some sort of kinds. There needs to be a public entry in some sort of kind. So there are certain criteria that needs to be in place, and then you can call yourself a museum. The second thing is that I always end up in panels where people question the museum. Well, I have to be honest, I'm a museologist, so I study the museum and sometimes nothing else. So for me, it's always very refreshing to be in those panels to understand what is there outside of the museum and why is it so important to study it, because it complements what the museum is. And this is basically my own perspective. I mean, of course, there are many other reasons to study what is outside of the institution, but for me, it's always interesting to see like where can it complement that what this institution maybe is not, or what this institution does not have. But to come to your question, what is this relationship between the websites and the museums? I think that has changed over time. So the Guggenheim one is indeed one of the first one. And why I find it interesting is indeed because the Guggenheim has been a brand, but it was also one of the first global brands. So it was the first museum who had, or not the first, but it was one of the first major museums who started to open locations all around the Western world, I have to say, because it was definitely not all around the world. But with that, they extended their brand internationally. And within that idea, they found it also very interesting to start opening a location online, because they, in that time, in the 90s, there was still the utopia around the web that it could reach a global audience like that. So for them, it felt like part of the brand to also have one location online in which they could explore this more international arena and actually also start exhibiting artworks there that had not been exhibited in any in not that kind of form. Just because you're also going into what was the relationship between the collection of the Guggenheim and actually the artworks that they wanted to show within this virtual museum, it's interesting that they saw it as a portal way towards internet art, and they were the first museum collecting internet art. So Brandon from Xulushan was in that time commissioned specifically for this museum. And Brandon, which was an internet artwork, which is now more or less a website, the idea was that it would be a completely immersive environment where you would have stand in and in which you could have experienced the whole artwork around you. So it would have had become a completely different artwork, and they were really collaborating with artists to see how they could create something online as well, and how that then indeed could also become something different or a different experience than what we had before when it came to art. So the Guggenheim was at the forefront with that. I mean, not long after that, John Apolito, of course, was also in the Guggenheim, and he was involved also within this project. So we do know that they had quite a strong pioneering had a role also within that. But you're completely right. It was a museum in a museum construct, a very museum that has been funded by private funders a lot. I mean, the Guggenheim had the whole collection, was a private collection when it started. So they were operating within that structure.
Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking that you were going to talk about the new icon definition of museums that was just out like maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. But it's like that's a museum, at least officially speaking.
Yeah, no.
Anyway,
Exactly right.
moving on to Renee and then Leah, raise their hands, and you in the chat, please do as well.
Yeah, just real quick. Like I found that definition you gave of the exhibition with registering a collection as very interesting and a little bit. Well, I don't want to say problematic, but it's complicated because in Mexico, for example, I know like nationally recognized, they're like big museums in Mexico that literally have no collection, like the MIDE, which is the Interactive Museum of Economy. And it's literally a museum about the Mexican economy, and it has no collection, no artifacts whatsoever. But it is recognized as a museum because it follows these ideas of educating the people about telling the history of economy in Mexico, about all these kind of things. And I also remember when I was doing my museology degree in the UK, not me, but another student was doing this program with a museum in Kenya, where they also had no collection because the collection in a way was the landscape around them and all these things, but it couldn't be registered as a collection. So I was wondering, like, do these places also fall within the idea of a museum, or how do we deal with this, like different places, especially in the global south, where we don't always have our own artifacts at sometimes, you know, never mind other people's artifacts. So I don't know what your impressions were on that and how it links back to this idea of the museum and the virtual museum and all these things.
Renee, I'm so happy you're bringing this up because you're so right about this, and I was inconsiderate there. I mean, I think it is. I think it's very much a Dutch UK perspective that I'm giving here, and I think indeed museums can be much more. And the idea of around the community museum, which is bigger in the global south, for example, I think is an extremely interesting phenomenon. And I think that ICOM also trains this definition has all to do with this as well. And I think indeed when we're talking in a more global context, we should definitely think more maybe in terms of tangible and intangible heritage and how certain institutions are able to transfer that. And even then we can question there again, indeed, the idea, what is an institution? The fact that that needs to be a building, for example, what we have this idea in the West that should be a building. Also, that can then be, of course, questioned. So I'm really happy you're bringing this in and that we open up this idea of what a museum is.
Thank you.
Yeah, Leah?
Yeah, it's good that René actually made the question I was going to say as well. I think this was my major question in terms for Karen. But also just first a comment. I'm also researching a museum in Portugal, in the south of Portugal, called Museum Zero, and they're also struggling to gain the Museum Association of Portugal the status of the official status of museum, because they're said to be an only digital art museum, and so they don't have a physical collection, but they have a physical space. So I think that's also that differs from country to country and from museum association to museum association. But I think the struggle is worldwide, and the connection that I was going to make is that, you know, nowadays with the let's say post-pandemic, if we will, context, we're now realizing that museums can have many forms and be virtual, online, and so on. But that's just a comment. And my question for Karen, and I think René also can also answer this, because Karen mentioned the challenges of web archives, of creating, maintaining web archives and digital projects. You talked about access, usability, and display. And then Hene also talked about costs of generating these projects. But I also wanted you to maybe comment a bit about not only generating, but maintaining them. And as from the point of view as researchers that depend on these projects being alive as much as possible, or at least being somehow archived or documented. If you have any views on that, or the challenges that we're facing in terms of the cost of maintaining these online and virtual projects.
I would like to explain that the context that I'm working in is in the library and not within the museum. So the web archives are situated in the Netherlands within the library, also within the UK, Denmark, Germany, Belgium. So these are quite large quantities, like the Internet Archive in the US as well, large quantities of data. And they have also, because of it, a different form of preservation in which they're thinking more about how to store large quantities of data. So it's more about server space than anything else. I do not have specific insights in how they're doing it. I did had a conversation with Jefferson Bailey not so long time ago about the Internet Archive. I said, how do you do it? Because, I mean, just to let you know, these collections, the web archives, are collected through robots. So there are no humans. Well, there are human activities within it, but there are robots that are constantly going over the web and are copying the web on a regular basis to make sure that these archives have an idea about how the web is changing over time. So that is, of course, there's constantly new data coming in. What I understood is, I said, how are you going to do it with energy? How is it going to be with server spaces? Is this going to be problematic? He said, well, if we're talking about energy, he said, don't underestimate how much NFTs take, then we take not so much. So he says, see it all relatively, but of course they have quite some servers. And they said, well, actually, they said another thing is that the disks on which they're storing the data, they are becoming so powerful that actually the storage space, literally, but I'm really curious how the ZGAM is experiencing this, but their literally storage space is not, the physical one isn't changing much because there you can store much more data on one disk in comparison to what, a decade ago. From that perspective, I know that they think that it is a sustainable practice and they will continue in web archive. But to think about indeed where to store data over time, that is something that I think is a huge question I don't dare to answer.
If I may, coming from the other side, from museums itself, first of all, I think we have so many databases for preservation of new media art that it's creating this fragmentation. So, for example, we have Art Store, which Rhizome keeps contributing to. We also have the Variable Media Questionnaire by John Ippolito and John Bell. Then we have Rhizome Artbase. Then we have Rhizome Archives. Then we have the ADA, which is the Archive of Digital Art. And then we have Rhizome's Conifer, just to name a very few. And that's not even counting individual collections like MoMA, Getty, etc. So there are ways, and some of these are free. For example, Variable Media Questionnaire, Conifer, they're very good for preserving living things. Well, living things in terms of digital media, right? But it can be adapted to museums. I myself, like my manual talks about how you can apply this to physical collections. But one of the problems that we find is that everything is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And it's very dependent on funding. And so I think one of the biggest risks with collections right now, and conserving these collections and archiving them and presenting them to the public, is this lack of a centralized database. And the problem is everybody has their own solution. Everybody prioritizes different things. So I don't know how we're going to solve this, but that's what I'm like. I think, does that solve your question? Or attempts to?
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. And just reply, I think it was Karen had asked about ZCAM, right? I actually worked there as a researcher, so I don't know much about the data management, apart from my own experience as a researcher of actually making use of the archives and data management software and so on. So unfortunately, I can't say much about that. But what I can say is that sometimes, and maybe you all can agree with that, sometimes big museums and big institutions, they have, we think that they have everything under control, and they know, the best practice and everything, but sometimes it's not. And they're also learning, especially because the technology is advancing so fast. It's really hard to keep track of things, and having to update departments over and over and over. It's quite hard. So I think even ZCAM struggles at some point, is also trying to reach out and figure out how to deal with the data issue.
Antoinette had her hand up. I don't know if she still has a question.
Various people said things that I was going to say about data and archives, but I want to reflect for a second on the fact that we are so obsessed with archiving everything, that the archive is taken the place of the collection in people's minds who work a great deal with digital media, because the idea of collecting web art is very often silly. What you really need to do is provide software that allows it to continue to be seen, which is a different thing from collecting something and kind of walling it off. But I think a lot about how, before about 1870, almost all live performance went unrecorded. I mean, except you could make music, a music notation, but theater performances, the great actors, nobody knows what they really did in the 19th century, except there are some actual written descriptions. And what if we stop to think that not everything has to be documented, recorded, and archived? And right now, the default position is everything must be saved. And I tend toward that mindset because I'm an artist and I don't want my stuff to disappear, but it's very much a product of the ability to save in the last 150 years. And it strikes me that there might be some problematic aspects of this mindset, that it's not just that it requires enormous money and resources to save many things, and therefore you have to be able to get access to those money and resources, but that's also diverting money and resources in an increasingly scarcity-based world from other things. And it's in a way, the belief that everything should be saved is also a position that it's a philosophically interesting position, that we don't know which things people are gonna care about in 100 years. So we have to save everything just in case. But that doesn't really take account of how scattershot, fragile, and contingent human life is to start with. We're going to lose a great deal of things, including every human life on the planet right now, just because people will die. So there's a way in which I'm struggling with this thought. I don't know quite where I'm going, but maybe there's a way in which thinking about what and how we save things is something we actually need to take another stab at.
That was great, Renee. Oh, sorry, Renee, no, Antoinette. That was also great, Renee. Sorry. I think that you just translated the sentiment that I have for a long time. More and more I've been working close to people that deal with archives, and new media art preservation, time-based preservation has become a topic surrounding me closer. And I think that there's a lot of assumptions that we make about preserving in history and collecting that are going unexamined. And the whole logic of containment and objectification that museums often use to deal with culture, it's perhaps part of the problem. Like, museums need to change because our modes of cultural production and modes of expression are changing, or maybe they have always been different from what we consider them to be. Maybe the artwork is more a product, or the art object is more a product of the museum than the other way around. But anyway, just I like the idea of just letting things go. And Karen had her hand up.
About something else, to be honest, and I will briefly mention it, but then go back to the discussion indeed. What do we need to preserve? What, and is there also things that we should keep alive, and maybe by keeping it alive, preserving it, or preserving maybe a spirit of something, or maybe not preserve it at all. The right to be forgotten. Very briefly, René, you were mentioning we need a centralized database. I don't know if we need that. And that has to do with that I believe in the decentralization of the web. So that is where I'm thinking, ooh, if we have a centralized database, I mean, the Internet Archive has already a little bit this position within the archival world, and they becoming quite powerful. So, well, that's something to consider. But there is also the opportunity, and Rhizome is doing that. Their complete archive is in the semantic web. So they're working with Wikibase. Wikibase has a data structure underneath their archive, which makes it possible to connect their archives to other archives. For example, in Europe, we have Europeana, and there is a possibility, theoretical still, to search through both their archives at the same time. At the moment, this is not reality yet because they're still into silos. So it's not that they have broken it open yet and you can search through all of their collections. But the structure is there that in the end, you could just connect them and start searching in both collections at the same time, which is called Sparkle, which is a program language that makes you able to search through the semantic web. Like Rijksmuseum is completely in the semantic web. I assume the MoMA is as well. So there are institutions who are doing it. Of course, here I hear the question already, like, what about the small institutions? This is a huge problem. Wikibase is working on this. Wikipedia had the knowledge base of Wikipedia to see, can we make this also affordable for smaller institutions? Because it's still quite an expensive endeavor. But then indeed, coming back to what should we archive and what shouldn't we archive, this is something I would like to give back to the panel because I find the questions around canon always very difficult. I wait until the canon.
Just real quick on that, there was this paper by, oh God, I just lost it. Hold on, give me a second. Okay, there we go. By Bonnie Mitchell, Janice T. Serlman, Wim van der Plas, and Terry C. W. Wong. And they were talking about interconnecting ADA, ACM Sysgraph, ICEA archives, the Electronic Language International Festival, Ars Electronica, and other archives in a way that's like, we don't centralize it completely, but we create this central place where you can access all of them, kind of like JSTOR and all these things, right? Like, because as you say, like just giving them a complete power, it's absolutely wrong, and I agree with you. I think what I mean is more like this idea of a centralized source to find it, and yeah, go to the archive of ICEA, go to the archive of somebody else. I'm gonna paste the link for this talk just so everybody can read it and maybe get. They're actually looking for collaborators, so if you're interested, you can talk to them there. But yeah, so just wanted to add that little bit.
You know, one of the things that happens in a heavily remix based culture such as we live in now is that a certain number of things are preserved in a new form because they are adopted and reused even without permission. And so there's a way in which that living transmission is at least as interesting to me as whether we can actually emulate things directly forever.
That's a beautiful idea. Sojan.
Hi everyone, my name is Sojong Kang. Sorry, I couldn't fully concentrated because a lot of distractions going on, and I apologize, I turned off the camera for a while. It was fascinating talks and I really enjoyed it, discussions, but I wonder, like, I just have a questions to like everyone, because during the pandemic, a lot of a lot of roles of institution is changing, especially in the museum, and a lot of people are start to focus on like, you know, like virtual archive. But also I just wonder, how can we sort of archive more phenomenology or ontological aspects, because still I can see a lot of archive and museum in the web, like picture and descriptions, and I can see that like it's really hard to grasp sort of, you know, a lot of fictive or like complex ideas of, you know, artifacts or presence or artwork, or like some sense of subjectivity as an artist. So I just wonder if there's any ways we can archive some sort of like ontological or physical phenomenological aspects of the artwork or artifacts or history. So I'm really curious of, is there any movements around? Yeah, so that's my questions. But anyway, thank you so much.
I feel like I'm monopolizing this talk, but sorry. You might want to look at the Variable Media Questionnaire by John Ippolito and my own manual, which is based on the Variable Media Questionnaire, which is the in-main manual. It's a WordPress because I need funding for an address. Anyhow, what we talk about in both those documents and those spaces is this idea of when you preserve, you preserve interviews with the artist, their interpretation of the work, how they wish it to be preserved. What they mean by it, even though that's very flexible. If you ask Picasso what the bull in the Guernica means, he gives you 17 different interpretations depending on who's asking. But this idea of preserving what the artist wants, what the artist thinks, what the artist feels, you don't only preserve the work, but the data and information around it. So in the case of your work, maybe your sketches, your an interview with you about what the work means to you, what the work means in relation to your context, the context in the world, all these things. And just meta tag it and create this more comprehensive variable, and that's why it's called the Variable Media Questionnaire. And finally, the idea of the preservation of the work itself. How do you want it to be recreated? Do you want it to let it die? Do you want it to be reinterpreted? Because that opens up so many possibilities rather than just emulating, which is very difficult. If you say, well, I'm open to reinterpretation, that allows something like Solowit's work, where okay, you leave the instructions and somebody else can say, okay, we can redo this thing, but instead of using CRTs, we can use LCDs and make them look like CRTs, or we can emulate this with a screen and then some glass so it feels like the work. Or maybe you don't even care about that. You just say video. So those kind of efforts are being done, and I think you might be very interested in checking, especially the Variable Media Questionnaire. Hope that helps.
Nia?
Yeah, I was going to comment on that and reflecting on what said previously. I mean, when working with archives and come to terms to that at some point, and it's also with time goes, as time goes by, we also change our interest in those documents, in those objects and things. So, and perspectives on it. For example, in my case, I'm really interested in discussing exhibition spaces, and it's really hard to find actually details on documentation of past exhibitions because they were not focused on the space itself, with the, you know, how the displays and everything. They were focused on the artists, on the artworks and things like that. And it was talking about, you know, the importance also of interviews, let's say, and also interviews are very focused on this one person narrative perspective sometimes, and this is very restrictive as well. And for us who are working with space, this is very frustrating, let's say the least, But just to say that things, interest changes, and then we have to open up to discussion and be able to say, okay, and some institutions and some initiatives are now thinking, okay, we need to put a little bit more information about the space and document the exhibitions and how they were portrayed and things like that to be able to cover now this new interest, for example.
Folks, I think we have time for one final question or comment. So if anyone from the audience or panelists want to jump in, there's Karen, but there's another, there might be a time for another one. So Abel, yes?
Hi. Hi, my name is Abel. I'm a artist who is currently addressing the issues about art criticism and institutional critique. So I'm really interested in the idea of how institution has been considered and objected by other communities other than the field of art and also within the art as well. So my question is, what are some of the present conditions and limitations of the institution in terms of art field? And what are the important causes that we should keep in mind when we reconsider or, or even like reposition the role of art criticisms and art discourses in the context of the institution being the most responsible for a sort of archiving or policing the positioning, what we considered conceptual or what we consider good or bad within this kind of institution that we heed so much at present. Thank you.
Wow, that's a good one. Yeah, if anyone wants to jump in. I feel that one of the biggest challenges, just to give people time to think, is like nowadays is how much they need to compete with like online platforms for attention and relevance, and even or very on relevance. Anyway, so Antoinette.
Well, hi, Abel. So I have been living and working in Los Angeles for the last 20 years, which is one of the art capitals of America in the sense of where the money goes and how the money dominates the kind of art that people see. We just got a new museum, the Broad Museum, funded by a very rich developer, and his collection is now museum worthy because there was the money there to make it happen. It seems to me that there's a conversation about what happens in America with very big institutions with lots of money. And then there's a conversation around what everyone else is doing and can do. And that, it seems to me, the place where all the experimentation is happening. I mean, the music, as Karen was saying, Guggenheim does some things, and there was the Walker Arts Center was very early in supporting digital media. There's been places like Whitney Artport was a wonderful Christian Paul's initiative, but these are all took very smart people to do them, like one person in each institution, John Ippolito as well. So the question then becomes, is the movement outside of those big points of gravity enough to shift the whole landscape over time? Because that's the stuff that's really interesting is happening outside the big museums. That's my point of view, and maybe people who work inside museums don't agree, but that's the place to watch, and it's all going to be dependent on what happens with capitalism over the next 100 years, frankly, because in America it's so driven by the capitalist economy. Unless as that changes, if that disintegrates, if it becomes more extreme, whatever happens is going to change the landscape more than almost anything else, because it signifies what's possible in public terms, people will still be operating and doing interesting things outside of that. But a very large percentage of the public thinks art is what they see in museums. And so that is going to continue to dominate the conversation for better and for worse.
Thank you, Professor Lafarge. I would like to respond to that because I think it is a really interesting angle that we always think that there is some change being undertaken in outside of the institution, trying to maybe not turn over, but trying to make people inside of the institution be aware of that they're not aware of and rethink their position in history, in the art discourses under the context of capitalism. And also, my recent study has been conducted with Andrew Fraser's essay about from the institution of critique to from the critique of the institution to an institution of critique, which she points out that the idea of institution exists inside of ourselves, actually from another perspective, and it is impossible to disavow as artists or other art professionals our role of creating or perpetuating the conditions of institutions. So maybe there is not an outside, but instead of another position or alternative consideration inside the institution which we can work with as well. So that's something that I think it is interesting, and I don't know what kind of position that we should be taking now, because I think there are a lot of young artists, or even under the within the popular cultural atmosphere, that people are trying to de-announcing the institution. But what if we are the institution? How can we denounce from ourselves? And it is really important to reject sort of that kind of institutionalization, but instead, as Fraser says in her essay, that maybe it is a question of what kind of institution we are and what kind of values we institutionalize, what forms of practice we reward, and what kind of reward we aspire to. That's something that I've been working on with. Fraser just points out, raise up sort of a potential or possibility in this conversation, but I think there is something more that we can dig on following this conversation. That's my point. Thank you.
Thanks, Abel. Thanks all the panelists. I think that we came back to an interesting point, talking about the ambivalence of institutions again. We love to hate them, we hate to love them. That's, I mean, maybe fate. It was really great to have the conversation today. Officially, we need to wrap up the conversation now. If you want to stay a bit longer at the Zoom, yeah, please do. I just want to open 1 extra minute for Karen and for Renee, because they have calls going on and that might be relevant to people in the chat. So Karen and Renee, if you want to share your calls and invite people to submit stuff orally.
Karen, you go first.
Yeah, so we're me and my colleague Natasha Provoshnik, we're editing a special issue in the journal Internet Histories. I'm sorry, I'm making everything art history. That's me. So, and it's about museums on the web. So, and that can be very broadly. I really like the idea that was discussed today as well about the fictive institution, or what is there outside of the museums, and can we even stretch the idea of the definition of the museum? So I wouldn't exclude that neither. I also think we can also think about these kind of conversations, but it's very much like what happened on the web in the last, let's say 25 years when we have a World Wide Web. And yeah, if there's anyone interested, love to read your abstract.
I'm really
I am
considering.
super interested. I just want a quick question then, because I saw on the website it says 10 of September, the deadline. And then you mentioned on your talk 24th of September. So tell me now which date is it so I can
24th.
plan ahead.
Yeah, we had the 10th, and then we found out that actually we had the panel today, and we thought, oh, if there's someone who likes to submit, we would like to give some time. So no worries, it's the 24th, and it has been I think now it is changed on the website. At least that's what I heard from Niels. He
Yeah.
changed.
Perfect.
When would I have to
Thank
have
you.
this ready?
Before the 24th of September.
Oh dear God. Okay, I'll try and
For
send
the
something.
abstract. Yeah.
It's
Oh,
only-
just the abstract. Okay.
yeah,
okay.
so it's very
Doable, yeah.
short. It's more really so we get an idea of what you would like to write about. Yeah.
Okay. I'll think about something sometime.
Oh, great, thanks.
Meanwhile, on the header footer gallery, we're launching a new open call for artists, but obviously anybody's open. Artist is just a label. And on video game, on artists exploring video game screenshots as a means of artistic expression. That means it's not just like, oh, I just walked around and took screenshots of video games, but you're welcome and encouraged to modify them, change them, reinterpret what a video game screenshot is. So we're keeping it quite open. We're only accepting screenshots and GIFs, so not machinima. That would be another exhibition. I need things for the gallery later. And yeah, so you're welcome. The call is open until November 10th. So there's a lot of time for you to develop something, or your students, whoever. And yeah, pretty much. If you have any questions, just let me know.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, everyone. We'll be posting the panel to our YouTube channel today, really soon, if you want to share it with anyone. And I hope to see you next week for, I don't remember what's the topic of next week. It's sites of exhibition with 4 new presentations that will be also online later today, actually midnight EST. It was really a pleasure, and yeah, take care, everyone.
I would
Bye-bye.
love to share email with anyone who has from this group. I was going to put mine in the message because I'd really like to continue a couple of these conversations. Thank you.
Oh, I have an email open, so I'll just do that right now.